welcome to this week's episode of the Building Texas Show. It's going to be an interesting conversation around land and conservation and everything that goes into how we're building Texas from an infrastructure, population, and conservation mindset. My guest today is Ben Eldredge with the Cibolo Conservancy Land Trust, right?
That's correct.
So we're really excited to talk about what the Conservancy does today because I've watched it form, I've watched it really come to fruition, and then I've seen some of the landowners that have really benefited from conservation and what the Conservancy helps them realize with their land. But can you help our listeners understand what is the Conservancy and what do you do with it?
Yeah, well, so the Cibolo Conservancy Land Trust was founded in 1998. It has around 14,500 acres currently in conservation. And what they do is what a land trust does is puts what are called conservation easements on property. Now, here's the caveat I want to lead with, though, which is that I can call them custom conservation easements because these easements are highly customizable. You literally custom tailor it according to the landowner's wishes for the future of their property, but also for the specific landscape and some of the conservation values that a landowner may have for that landscape. They may have areas that they don't want any development, and they may have areas that they want to leave available for development, like building envelopes, or even to cut out of the easement. So it's extremely customizable. And so sometimes we also like to call them custom conservation agreements because they're not, they're net positive for the landowner and they're net positive for conservation, and their options that they're based on the landowner deciding to put this easement on the property. It is not foisted on them. There are not usually requirements on that easement that the landowner has not decided to place in that easement. Now, there are scenarios where people maybe want to abuse an easement and say, oh, well, they don't really want the full conservation value protected, and then, to a significant enough degree. And then that's what a land trust might say, hey, we can't carry that easement because it's not truly a conservation. Now, a landowner does get significant tax benefits from a conservation easement. So if they have federal income taxes that they need to write off or could benefit from writing off, this is a great way to do it because not only do you get a tax benefit for the first year you put your conservation easement on, you get it for the following 15 years. So a full 16 years of federal tax benefit. Now that benefit is about 50% of federal income tax per year. So you can write it off over time. And that benefit is based on the amount of value, development value that you basically are donating into a conservation easement. So it's seen as a charitable donation, and you're writing off that charitable donation over 16 years. So it's some people actually decide to do these easements specifically for the charitable donation. Also, the landowner continues to own that land, and they can sell it, they can bequeath it to their next of kin. And so, there aren't many downsides, and frankly, they often resell at normal appraised value because they're often larger properties, and people who want to buy those larger properties, they don't necessarily mind that there's an easement as long as they're not looking for a developable property to put lots of houses on. They're usually looking for something that's appealing for their grandchildren to come to and enjoy playing at.
Quality of life property more so than a development opportunity.
Exactly. A vanity ranch is another way to put it, right? But at the same time, they will usually pay standard appraised value as if the easement isn't even on the property. And we see that a lot. So you get the tax benefits, plus you can still sell the property, or your kids can sell the property. And there's no real downside financially.
So when you say easement, and I come out of my cooperative background, and I think of power line easements, I think of easements from the next property owner where you have a drive-through kind of a access easement. But I would have always understood the easement is dictated by the state or the local government or the utility. I've never thought about the idea of, if I own the land, who do I partner with to create what is called an easement? I would think I'd need to go to an attorney. The attorney may or may not give me all of the information. But what I hear you saying is your group, the Conservancy, is a group of experts that can come in and really understand what is that value in the land, what should be conserved, what is the full potential, all of the options.
Right.
And then from there, they can decide what's best for them.
That's correct. That's correct. So the one difference is that when a utility puts in an easement, they actually have powers of eminent domain oftentimes, not in all cases, but they're usually saying, hey, we're coming through your property, like it or not. And we see that, of course, with pipelines as well. We can see, some of the government entities will use eminent domain to put in roads, things like that. So this is not that. This is a chosen path for a landowner. They are not required to do this by anybody. I'm not aware of any easements that have been conservation easements that have been the product of an eminent domain effort. That just doesn't really happen. So at all.
So it's more of a private property tool.
That's right. It's a total private property tool. That's right.
To really ensure that your property extends its life in the way that you see fit as the property owner.
Right.
Which might be conservation and hiking trails with limited access to the public.
That can be an option.
Okay. Or it could be there's no access.
That's right.
But we agree we're not going to build houses. We're not going to change the water flow, things like that.
In a way, you can almost think of it. So there's no requirement for public access at all. Some landowners in rare circumstances say that they're open to that or that they'll encourage that, but that's pretty rare. This is private property, so it is not open to the public. There's no requirement for their access. So the way, blanket on this one. I think where you were going with all that.
Well, it goes into the private property rights conversation for Texans, because this is different than, let's say, Colorado, where you have BLM, Bureau of Land Management properties. That's public access. You can go do a lot of things. In Texas, it's 98% private property. There's very little public land in Texas.
That's right.
And so I guess the root of my question around easements is it's really the benefit of the property owner, but it's also the benefit of the state.
Well, so that's correct. So here's the thing is that we are dependent on what we call natural infrastructure. That's what I like to call it anyways. And so that's your healthy watersheds that slow filter and sink water in to the subsurface. Now, some of that water will come out as the base flow in our streams. Mm-hmm. And so when you see your streams go dry, it's because the water table is not being replenished. And if you pave everything over, well, then you're not going to get any replenishment of that water table. Say goodbye to your springs, your seeps, and your streams, right? So then the other thing too, of course, is if we pave over the recharge zone, right? The karst geology that looks like it's like Swiss cheese, or it actually is very much like a colander,
which is so much of our hill country.
So much of Kendall County for sure, and yes, very much of the hill country. And if you pave that over, well, then again, you're preventing water from going into the aquifer. And the more you do that, the more you not only do you have to prevent water from going to the aquifer, but the more impervious cover you put on a landscape, the faster the water will sheet off. It will go down to a stream, and it can bypass the recharge zone, because when you get a storm event, it might be that much more extreme that the water frankly rushes past recharge, rather than slowing that water down so that it does go to the recharge zone and replenish aquifers. And much of San Antonio and Austin, of course, have invested a lot of money in protecting those recharge features, because they know that they're dependent on some of this water supply, right? And similarly in Kendall County, the citizens have realized that they would rather see both preserved open space, because most people moved here for the amenity, the quality of life enhancement of nature, but also we realize we are dependent on the groundwater supply. There are some other water sources from around the region, but most of us who live, off grid, if you will, away from major pipelines, we are truly dependent on groundwater.
And that's typically a county resident. That is not getting services from City of Bernie. So they're not getting what I would say is GBRA water.
Right.
They're getting groundwater from a well. And I think the conservation community around Kendall County has done a lot of work to really draw that water conversation, and then think about policy. And this is where it's the private property rights versus the legislative rights of the state.
Right.
And it really is a lot of the county and then the water districts working together to say, well, what does our development look like in the future? How many wells can we handle? And that's a county by county decision, or is it water district? Who makes those decisions?
Well, so water districts can specify basically well spacing and And basically that tends to translate to minimum acreage for a well site. But then the county often shows up and says, yeah, we're going to recognize 10 acres as the minimum number of acres you need to put in a well.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened in Kendall County because we have a limited water supply.
Yeah.
The reality is when you look at the state legislature, you hear a lot of things about finding new water that they'll then pipe in from some distant sources. And the reality is it's unlikely that you're going to run pipeline all over the bloody hill country to these remote landowners who, because they've run out of groundwater. And so we have to safeguard that supply. That is a private property right, the right to landowner, but it is a private property right to have access to that groundwater, provided you meet certain, criteria of land ownership. And then that private property right could be taken away simply by depleting the water supply.
Correct.
So our job I'm on the Cow Creek Groundwater Conservation District, and our job is actually to protect that private property right to groundwater.
To make sure that there is groundwater available for existing.
To make sure your neighbor's not drawing down your well to the point that you're out of water, to make sure that for the foreseeable future, you've got water. That also translates into your land's value because you have water that's accessible for use. Yeah. And so, it's funny because yes, when we talk about regulation on groundwater supply, we are actually talking about regulation to protect private property rights. That's kind of the irony of that.
And then to bring it back to the Conservation Trust, part of that protection is ensuring that those waterways aren't being developed and that we are educating our private property owners around how can they best develop. And develop's the wrong word because they're not out doing this stuff, but I've seen material coming out of the Hill Country Alliance and other conservation partners that really do help us understand, how far off of that water system do we need to be before we're really doing human activity that's going to change the watershed.
So you're saying, how much do we need to conserve, essentially?
How much do we need to conserve, but how much do we need to keep impervious cover, concrete,
right,
off of the side of a riverbank?
Oh, yeah. Right.
That's there's this key important line from where the water is to where it's getting into, and I don't know the technical word, but there's
sure. So it's basically essentially the flood zone it's often called the riparian zone, and we think of it as a stream side. And the thing is, that's part of that natural infrastructure I talked about because it's known as the riparian sponge. When there's a flood event, it soaks up water and swells just like a sponge. And then once that flood event is over, that sponge essentially deflates and it releases that water into that stream, again, maintaining that base flow. Because the whole, basically the whole stream side, the literal stream side, right where the water reaches the edge, is basically a huge seep. And the water table's coming right there and seeping out into the stream, and then that water's flowing down the stream. So we need to protect it for that reason. The other thing too, of course, is that you have trees oftentimes along, it's all vegetated along those stream sides. Well, that creates these little eddies. Basically, it slows water down. So it mitigates the intensity of stormwater events. But the thing is, to protect our streams, we also have to protect the uplands, because if the water's sheeting off so fast that it's coming down like a sledgehammer and it's tearing out all of those trees, what happens? You lose the trees, you lose the roots that then also hold the riparian area, that stream side, in place, all the soil. So then that erodes, and now you no longer have the sponge.
Yeah.
So you lose so many values if we don't protect our natural environment in this way. And we truly are dependent on this for our safety in that case from a major stormwater event, but again, also our water supply. And then finally, obviously the quality of life. I mean, most of us have not been getting our kayaks out and going into the Guadalupe River because the flow is just not sufficient and the water's kind of gross, unsafe in some areas, you could argue. So we got to think holistically about how we develop the landscape, because, unbridled growth does have detriment to the public's well-being, and frankly, not just the quality of life, but the local economy.
Yeah.
I mean, you were part of the Economic Development Corporation of Bernie-Kendall County strategic planning, and it specifies that maintaining natural resources is a part of the economic well-being of our region. In other words, that people move here because it's the hill country. Yeah. They don't move here because it's pavement and rooftops. They move here because it's the hill country, and it's also country. Yeah. It's trees, it's grasses, it's streams, and our recreation places are oftentimes those outdoor environments. that we lose if we don't take care of them. So
I'm going to take a quick minute and talk about one of my favorite videos on YouTube. It's put out by the San Antonio River Authority, and it talks about the history of San Antonio through the view of water. And in all of this conversation, I'm reminded to say that we are the flash flood capital in the world, legitimately, and it's because of geological makeup, that limestone and that fast run of water that you're talking about. We all know that the hill country rains that we get, and we see the 18 inches of rain in an hour, but then it's gone.
yes,
And so that's what you're really talking about. And I appreciate that you brought up economic development, and I mentioned the Sarah video because that's where San Antonio started. It started on the riverbank of the San Antonio River and really grew from there because water and conservation were such an important part. The Olmos Basin, people from hundreds of years ago would collect there because of the trees, the natural beauty, the flowing water, all of the things that created that economic impact.
right.
We grew. And then you look at the Riverwalk. The Riverwalk is the result of flash flooding. And many people died in a flash flood event. So the city put in some barriers to try and do a lot of what you're talking about, flood mitigation, collection. But then it became economic impact. And we see that as downtown San Antonio. It's a beautiful piece of...
That's right.
But if you really know it, you know it's an engineering marvel.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing was the San Antonio River was channelized, meaning they straightened it. And then they realized, wait a minute, water, it just naturally wants to do that bending and weaving, et cetera. And that when you take that away, not only do you increase the flood pressures, but you also increase erosion.
Yeah.
And you basically also are creating a non-river. You have this wonderful natural amenity that now you've just turned into a ditch.
Yeah.
And they realized, wait a minute, that could be a natural amenity again, and we can put trails along it, and we can restore it, and we can restore those bends in the river. And my, oh my, what do you know? You've got a healthy, vibrant community that forms around those kinds of features.
Yep.
So, and going back to your point earlier, there is a reason, the hill country is called Flash Flood Alley. It's called it's known as hydrophilic. It's one of like the top regions in the world, top 2, I want to say, where you have flash flood events that are the most intense you'll find from storm events. Yes, it's partly because of the geology. I think also the history of some poor land stewardship. The land was overgrazed, and that you had treated in certain ways that resulted in a lot of soil loss. And when you lose that soil, you no longer get that that slowing that water down effect, that sponge, that sinking it in. And so subsequently you end up with worse flood events. And then, of course, we will sometimes have hurricanes that come in and stall right over us. And that's when you tend to have those, epic, 8-inch or so floods or the Wimberley flood that took a number of lives. And damaged a lot of property.
And so let's come back to conservation and the work that you do. Who is your customer? Who is the landowner that comes to you and says, here's my heart? Because I think that's where it starts more often than not.
Well, I think the overwhelming majority want to conserve their land because they feel an affinity for it. It is in their heart, to your point. They have spent a lot of their lives stewarding that property, but also going there for their peace of mind. And, there's really nothing like being out in some open space, say while the sun's setting, right? And you hear, the cricket frogs chirping, and you can also hear the crickets chirping, and you watch the dragonflies buzz over the water or over the landscape, and it brings a sense of awe. And they realize that there's value in that experience, that frankly, that makes life more valuable, more worth living. And that also this inspiration for that awe could easily be destroyed by somebody looking to exploit the landscape for maybe some short-term personal gain. So that's a very common theme, is that we have people that love the land, but also they're thinking about estate planning because they're going to have to transfer either the land to their kids, and they want to either protect it for the kids or protect it from the kids. That's honestly a real thing. But also they're seeing the tax advantages of putting this land into conservation, both for their own tax benefits, but also for some of their life estate planning to soften the blow of estate taxes on their next of kin. So there are some real economic reasons that some people do decide to put their land into conservation. So but I would say most people do it because their heart's in the right place. And that's usually I think that's because they're also the ones willing to look at the idea.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a subset of people who maybe are truly looking to keep more money in their pocket that are overlooking these easements because they're just not drawn to the word conservation. But the reality is this is almost like a financial conservation instrument or a tax conservation instrument. So, or tax dollar conservation instrument, I guess I should say. The point is, there are many values that can be brought to bear in this. And honestly, developments could include conservation easements.
Well, that's what I want to ask about, because you brought up the economic impact before we talked about San Antonio and how that example, but let's look into the Hill Country. There's a number of small towns. You can think of Bernie, Kerrville, Fredericksburg. They're all on waterways of some sort. They've all grown up regionally because of agricultural promise and product. Railroad came through them because they were already there. But it was based on the natural formations of our land. And when we look at that, so much population has come in that maybe doesn't fully understand how sensitive the Hill Country in particular is, because it is a lot of our aquifer recharge, a lot of our first elevation coming in the Llano Estacado, and kind of how this is framed. But everybody wants to move west. They want to move west for the quality of life. Where does agricultural conservation education play into this? Because there are some, I'll say, conservation properties that do allow like that front end education. They may have a store or a shop on the roadside so you can learn more about it. But how often do people really can they get out to experience some of these lands? Where would you send somebody that's new here to say, here's a great experience, here's a great example of how a community steward conservation?
Well, so, we don't have a whole lot of examples of what are called conservation developments, which is where you cluster the house. So instead of saying, okay, we have 100 acres, we can put in 10-acre minimum lots. And so we're now going to just create this quilt of fragmented landscapes. Instead, what we're going to do is take those potential 10 homeowners and we're going to cluster them in a community in this one portion of the property. And then the rest of the property is going to be held essentially by their HOA, if you will, as tenants in common, where they share in the management responsibility, cost, et cetera. But then also they all get to benefit from accessing that land. There are a few developments in the region that do provide some of that. Sometimes it's just by happenstance because, it's hard to develop the deep canyons. And so they end up saying, all right, well, we'll go ahead and put trails through those canyons. And now people are loving living there. They don't mind living right next door to a neighbor like they would almost in an urban area or a suburban development because they have so much access to nature right outside their back porch, going down into a canyon and being able to walk a whole trail system around it. And so what we're looking at as a conservation community is not only promoting that vision, but supporting that vision. Because here's the thing, a developer can put in that sort of conservation development where he clusters the buildings or puts them along the ridgeline and preserves the canyons. And by putting the easement on the canyons, now he can also lessen his tax hit from sale, from return on investment.
But can still make it an amenity as hiking, access, nature trail. That doesn't change the use of property. And I've seen that use with the trail system around San Antonio, Canyon Land, Redland Road. That canyon land becomes a playground. You can't really build it. You can't really do anything else, but it's beautiful trails now.
Right.
My pushback on this, and it's my ignorance, is we talk a lot about density. So you said 10 acres to do a well. I know locally we have some density rules around, like, how could you squeeze somebody down to an acre? Like, and it's not going to squeeze to an acre, but there's a density number per acre per development that I understand. How do we help our rule makers think about that balance? Because I enjoy what you're saying. I would like that neighborhood because I would see the benefit of everything else.
So Hays County has actually created a method for allowing for conservation development.
Okay, great.
Okay, so they already have the rules in place. And also, if the groundwater district, in our case, I think we're ready for that as well, where we would allow that clustering.
Okay.
But again, the county's also got to create the context where that's permissible. And so I think we can look to Hays County. Now, here's the thing is that it's funny. I've had somebody say to me, oh, you can't mention Hays County and Kendall County because, people don't like Hays for whatever reason. And I sit there and I go, wow.
I love Hays County.
Well, I don't have an issue with Hays County, but I guess I'll say this. I get really tired of people making arguments that we can't adopt an idea because it comes from somewhere else and we don't like that place. I think a good idea is politically agnostic, it's place agnostic. Like, we need to be thinking in terms of what are the best ideas and bring them here so that Kendall County is the conglomeration of the best ideas that represent the desires, the values of Kendall County citizens, and not rule them out because they came from some foreign land that just, for whatever reason, irks certain political leadership. So I don't hope that's not the case in Kendall County, honestly, but I have heard that argument that you can't, like, people used to say you can't say certain city names. And I'm like, why not? If it's a good idea that we can use here, then we should be taking the good idea and using it. It has nothing to do with...
It's the collaboration, right? Let's take the best of everywhere.
That's
and
right.
Learn from it. We can tweak it and make it
Improve
ours.
it, yeah.
But I like the call to collaborate. And I think Hays has a lot to offer. I mean, if I think about Texas State University's there's a wealth of engineering talent and material science talent. And then you look at what else is being invested up and down that 35 corridor in Hays. And then finally, they've got the revenue to do a lot of things.
So our organization, we are developing a policy to facilitate conservation development, where we will work with developers to get better natural resource protecting development outcomes. Basically, let's conserve some of this open space and do as little harm to the property. They're still going to get the return on investment like any other development, but they're actually going to have a cooler development because of that ability to access natural areas and that tenants in common that allows people to have basically the equivalent of a large ranch surrounding their little community. And so, we've got a policy that we're working on. There's another organization I know of that's in the Hill Country that's also developed a policy in this regard. And so we're realizing, look, yes, we want to conserve as much land as we can, but simultaneously, we know land is going to get developed, and we want to make sure it's developed as responsibly as possible. We want win-win for developer community and for conservation community. And honestly, it's totally viable. It may take a little bit more imagination and, frankly, a breaking down of some paradigms about how land is developed and the habits of developers. Break those paradigms down, get the right engineers in the room. Let's make epic things happen and create for example, this region, Kendall County, it could be any of these other counties too, for that matter. We want to create a place that is just veritable heaven on earth, relatively speaking. I mean, where you can go and you can live there and you've got this sense of nature is surrounding you and hugging you in because, you're able to get there right out your back door. Right now, yes, people say, well, I've got my 10 acres, so therefore I've got a lot of space. But the way that 10 acres is often managed is very different property to property. And then you also hit your fence line and you can't go anywhere. Yeah. And if you're like a hiker or you're somebody who really wants to recreate, you're going to realize 10 acres doesn't get you very far at all. Yeah. And you have the opportunity to have basically an epic park right there around your development.
But what I also hear you saying is, like, Kendall County could do a lot for itself. Yep. To the same point, like, if it's not collaborative with Kerr and Gillespie, I mean, the water from Kerr flows into Kendall. So we've got to be working in partnership. And I think organizations like yours help us bridge those county lines.
Yes.
And thinking.
Yes.
And then who should be reaching out to you? Who should be calling the Conservancy? And in my mind, from this conversation, it's developers that want to think differently or know more about what their options are.
Yep.
And then families that are looking at succession planning.
That's right.
And just ensuring that they can be the stewards they already are for their land into future generations.
Mm-hmm. So, I think developers should be talking to us, political leaders. Yes, those people that are looking for the tax benefits for success, for generational succession, or but I mean, also people that are looking just plain for tax benefits. If you're a high income earner and you're getting hit hard in your federal taxes, then you want to show up with a solution that softens that blow while still giving you some, protecting what you might find you care about.
Yeah.
Once you realize that it's fiscally viable and even responsible to conserve because the tax benefits also provide a benefit, then maybe that's the way you want to go.
It broadens your legacy for sure. And I've seen some wonderful ranch owners that come to that realization and then they aspire to do more politically or in water districts or in when you really understand your stewardship as a landowner, you start to think of all of the processes and systems that are on your land, under your land, above your land. That's a different way of thinking.
Two things I noticed become kind of almost addictive in this sort of conservation world. One is rainwater harvesting. Once people start harvesting rainwater, they start wanting to add tanks and get every drop they can. The other one is conservation. Once people conserve their land, they want all of their neighbors to conserve their land. They start to become promoters of conservation. And some of our best messengers for conservation are actually landowners with conservation easements. We've got some that are extremely vocal in their communities, and sure enough, they're delivering landowners all around them because who better to hear from than somebody who has one and is experiencing the benefits of them and isn't necessarily saying that this is their industry, their business. This is just something that is a cool thing to do.
An opportunity to learn more.
That's right.
Have fuller options. Ben, thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing and really leading. Thank you for your service on a water district. If you live in a place in Texas that has a water district, get involved. Get to know them. They can be really helpful resources. And then finally, thank you for the way that you're building Texas.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on and let me talk about the land trust, like Cibolo Conservancy Land Trust. And I hope that people will feel free to reach out to me. I'm very approachable. You can go on our website, ciboloconservancy.org, and you'll find my phone number, my email, and just reach out. I'm there for you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.